Welcome to the Determinetruth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We are in week 3 of 2 Corinthians. So we've been going through the big picture of the letter and focusing on church and leadership and that sort of thing. So we're just going to continue taking another pass and looking at some other things. What all do we want to talk about today, Rob?
Before we start, and again, we want to really delve into the larger picture of 2 Corinthians, but you've recently joined the Determinetruth team.
Yeah.
I don't know if our podcast listeners know that or not, but if they go to the website now, your picture's on there. So you're like a legit in now. And why don't you tell our listeners some of the things that you've got going on and some things that you're going to be doing? You're hoping to help us with the India ministry, but what else you got going on?
Yeah, that one I'm excited about. And we have some stages of things that we're going to do. So I'm going to hop in there at some point and help you and Danny out with the pastors in India. To start off, just realized I have an email list of people who I know, who I have contacts, so I'm going to send out monthly or bi-monthly communications. If anyone else wants to get on that, if our listeners want to, can we throw my email address in the show notes today for this episode? And then people can just email me and say,
for my email address too. If you're not already on the Determinetruth mailing list, send me your email address and let me know that you want to be on that mailing list as well.
Yeah. So just email and just say, hey, listen to the podcast. Can I get on your monthly email? And do that for both Rob and myself, and we'll add you there. But launching, I sent an email out. Well, in real time, for me, it was on Sunday the 18th, I sent out an email. Going to be launching some things coming up. So in September, I'll start doing a Tuesday night Zoom Bible study group. So Rob, you have your Wednesday evening group. I'll have a Tuesday evening group. So we're going to go through the Gospel of John and we'll look at some of the theological things that are there. The deity of Christ is significant and whatnot, but we're also going to look at some fun things like, what is the Jewish background of John? What's happening with the feasts and Jesus and how he fulfills that? So we're going to look at some things that are oftentimes overlooked in such a popular gospel. So that's going to be a lot of fun. I also have a YouTube channel that I just started launching. So as of today, actually, I have 2 videos on there. I love riding motorcycles. I started filming those and then have theological teachings, like little 10.
So you're holding your phone with one hand while you're riding the motorcycle with the other?
That's exactly what I'm doing. No, so I did one on the Trinity.
No hands.
You'll like the one I launched today, actually. It's called, Why Don't Christians Take the Bible Literally? And so we talk about genre and the importance of that. But anyway, we can link to that in the show notes as well, my YouTube channel. And then people could go and watch the video, like it, subscribe to my channel. You'll get updates. I'm going to try to release a video a week. But yeah, those are some of the things that are happening along with this podcast. And I think some other things are going to pop up down the road.
Great.
So yeah,
Excellent. All right.
What do you have going on? Anything you want to update on?
We've got a whole series that Danny and I have been doing on the church and politics. If you haven't already been aware of that, we did a series of live streams. We did them on a couple on abortion that I really think are important conversations. I don't care if you're pro-life or pro-choice. I think they're really important conversations. We're doing a series on Israel, Gaza. We just had another one that went live. Of course, by the time this episode goes live, it'll been a couple weeks ago with Gary Burge. Talk about that. We've got a live stream coming up in September with Kristen Kanor, part 2, which related to the Gospel of John, by the way. Glory is such a big issue in the Gospel of John.
Yep.
And Kristen's insights are opening my eyes to things that I didn't see before. And then we're going to tie that to glory. And when you deprive people of glory and shame, how that brings about violence. We'll tie that to the war in Gaza. We have a live stream that will have hopefully have been live by the time this episode goes live on war and the business of war. And then in September, we hope to have a series on race and racism. And then I'm doing another series separately on Jesus and the kingdom that I think is really foundational and really significant, because I think Christians just simply don't know what the kingdom of God is about, let alone understand how to articulate it. And I think they even often have a misunderstanding of the gospel. And what is the gospel? What is the kingdom? Is justice a liberal thing? Is justice what the gospel tells us to do? So that series is under the playlist Jesus and the Kingdom on the Determinetruth YouTube channel. So subscribe to that and get more.
Awesome. That's some good updates. Check the show notes in this app today, and you could contact us and get on that information. And yeah, that'd be fun. Cool. Let's get into today's show. Let's take another pass at 2 Corinthians and focus on some stuff there. Yeah. I know that you've written a lot on the church, the purpose of the church, the goal of the Christian life. And it's important to understand that, especially in light of how we read the New Testament and vice versa, and then how we read that in light of the Old Testament, the whole biblical story. But growing up in evangelicalism, and we've talked about this before,
Yeah.
the point of Christianity is to get people to say a prayer to make Jesus their personal savior. It's moralism. It's just getting people to behave in a certain way. Even when we have, talking about politics, the arguments on like the 10 commandments in being, displayed at libraries or in schools, or we need to bring prayer back into schools. I think we talked about this a while back. It doesn't matter that we have an atheist teacher leading these prayers. It's just something about this moralism that exists where we just want to force this type of thing so people behave better. How do you think Paul would think about those type of topics as he's ministering to this Corinthian church? Is that the goal, that he's trying to get these folks just to behave better, to display the 10 commandments in someone's home? So it's maybe that's going to help them not get drunk before communion and exclude poor people and then have relationship with stepmoms. Is that what they needed? They just lacked prayer in there.
Wouldn't it have been so better if they had the 10 commandments written on their heart?
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Going back to Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 from last
how
week.
about if we write these on our own hearts before we take the speck out of their own? Yeah. It actually brings up a larger issue, Vinny, that we've been trying to address in the series of live streams on Jesus and the Kingdom, for example, and that is how much culture and the moment of the day and the worldview and the perspective and the ideology of the day, how much that's influenced the way we do church, which we're going to talk about as we continue to go through this series here, and how much we've wrapped our theological framework around that and how much that's influenced us. And that's it's individualism of the modern world. It's consumerism of the modern world. And this is foreign to the Christian gospel and foreign to the New Testament. So Ian, Spencer, and I are working on a book that might be out in probably at least a year from now. But I have a number of blogs on the topic of the gospel, the purpose of the gospel, and the goal of the Christian life. And I think, most Christians would say that the goal of the Christian life is to accept Jesus as the Lord and Savior, or something along those lines, right? And once you've done that, okay, cool. Now what do I do? And the answer is be good people, the moralism that you talked about. And the answer, I would say, no, the purpose is to be God's image bearers. Let's just go back to Genesis. He made us in his image, to bear his image, to reflect who he is to the creation. And in reflecting who he is to the creation, we are making Christ known. Jesus says in John 13, all men will know you are my disciples if you love one another. Right? The idea is when you do these things, you make me known. You act like me. You bear my image. And I think that's fundamentally what it is. 1 Peter 2:9, which I think is so central, because 1 Peter 2:9 is a New Testament version of the Old Testament mission. So Exodus 19 to the people of Israel coming out of Egypt now is now wrapped in 1 Peter 2:9 to the church by saying, and it says this, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that, and that's a really important translation. Many translations just simply say that, but so that, which is more reflective of the Greek, you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And again, when he says you may proclaim, it doesn't necessarily mean with words, but with our life, with who our very being and who we are. So I think that's very significant. That would be the purpose of the Christian life. Now, the goal of the Christian life, so that's the purpose, is missional, to make God known, to be his image bearers. And there's a lot to be said about that and how justice is inherent within that. And that'll be that part of the book that Ian's writing, that Vinny, that you would really like. I'll try to get you some early copies of the manuscript. But the goal of the Christian life is to become like Christ. That's the whole idea. Is the purpose is to reflect his image, but to do that, we must become like Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, now this particular letter specifically says, in verse 18, we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. That's huge. Are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord, the Spirit. And again, the live stream with Kristen Kanor, part 2 in early September, and go back to the one that we did, I think, in June on part 1. It's going to blow your mind. We think of glory, something that we give to God. To God be the glory. Great things he hath done, right? That's the hymn. But in the New Testament, actually, it's glory of God is something that we're supposed to receive. Look what it says, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. Whoa. We're looking at us in a mirror. We should see the glory of the Lord. Oh, we don't give glory to God alone. We actually become his glory. Look what he says. And then we are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. So I think the goal of the Christian life is to become like Christ, to reflect him, to bear his image, to be who he is. And they'll know you're my disciples if you love one another. So when we carry our cross and love our neighbor as ourselves and lay down our lives for the other, we are imaging Jesus and fulfilling the very goal of the Christian life. And in doing so, we fulfill the mission and the purpose of that, and that is to make Christ known. Let me give you one more verse here, and I'll let you chime in if you have any thoughts. Colossians chapter 1. I think this is really profound. Paul says, verse 28 and 29, Paul says, we proclaim him, which is Jesus, for Colossians 1, 28 and 29. We proclaim him, admonishing every person and teaching every person with all wisdom, so that we may present everyone complete in Christ. And you might know, Vinnie, the Greek word for complete there is telos. That's the end. The word for telos, like the end goal, the ultimate attaining, what we're striving for. We admonish every person and teach every person with all wisdom, so that we can present everyone complete in Christ. For this purpose, I labor, striving according to his power, which mightily works in me. There's Paul's mission statement, and that is to make everyone perfect in Christ.
Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob does on a weekly basis to pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters that get special behind the scenes access. But we can only do this with the generous support that comes from those of you who can afford to give. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting us with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to work hard to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinetruth.com and click on the Give tab, or follow the link in the show notes. Trying to think back, it's been years since I read Christopher Wright, but doesn't he talk about that in The Mission and the People of God? Is that what it's called? His book?
The Mission of God is like the magnum opus. And then he made a smaller version that's more accessible. Yeah. That is, it's the Mission of God's People, something like that.
Something like that.
So Christopher Wright, the W-R-I-G-H-T, if you want to look that up. Fantastic book.
Because I remember that was the first time when I read Christopher Wright stuff that I don't want to say it was new information, but I just think he phrased it in a way where it's like, okay, this makes sense.
This is totally sense. Yeah.
And especially coming from an evangelical background.
Sure.
Where you're only focusing on the individual, it was so helpful to say, oh, this guy's an evangelical, but he's also having a bigger purpose or telos of the Christian life. It's not just about me saying a prayer so I could go to heaven. We actually have a mission. Yeah.
Another book on that same note, Christopher Wright's book is fabulous. And it's would you say that even his smaller book is a little academic, or is it more
a little bit, but it's way more accessible.
It's way more readable. Yeah. The first one's not really.
Yeah. The other one's
1,200 pages or something like that. Yeah. It's fantastic. But Henry Blackaby wrote a book called Experiencing God.
Yeah.
He's a Baptist pastor. You know a book is good when it keeps getting reprinted. And it's probably been reprinted for the last 80 years.
Yeah.
And there's Bible study thing for it, and workbooks for it, and teacher book. There's so many different resources for it out there. So it is excellent. There's a little bit of the individualism and the Western mindset of consumerism. But for the most part, he says, when we ask the question, what is God's will for my life, we're asking the wrong question. We should be asking, what is God's will? What he means by that is, instead of saying, God, guide me through this today, guide me through that, give me the grace to do this, we should be praying each day, God, show me where you're working so I can join you there. Instead of inviting God to join us where we are, we need to invite ourselves to be open to work where God is. Whether we see a woman having trouble with her children in the grocery line, hey, can I help you now? Or at a counter at the airport, or a person on the side of the street. Maybe God wants us to work there. And it's a fantastic book. So Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about this, let's give maybe an overview of 2 Corinthians again. Probably not rehashing everything we've done before, but what's a way we could maybe look at the book through what we've set up?
I think the big thing to review here would be the fact that Paul, it's a very autobiographical letter or letters stitched together. Paul's defending his own apostolic ministry, that he's a legitimate apostle. They were charging Paul with being inadequate for ministry. Obviously, if it's one of those things when you don't like him or you want to rebut him, the way that you do that is you impugn his character, right? Oh, Paul's not a legitimate apostle. He's not one of the 12, or we are super apostles. And Paul responds by saying, look, I am qualified, I am gifted, and I am equipped by the Spirit, and you are my letter. I don't need letters of recommendation. You are my letter. But then there's a big theological issue, and that theological issue is that the new covenant has arrived with the coming of the Spirit. That's in chapter 3. We read a little bit verse 18 just a minute ago. Through the Lord and through the Spirit. That new covenant has arrived, and that's significant now because this one covenant with Moses is now finding its consummation and fulfillment with Christ. So I think that's the key issues, the major issues that are describing this letter. And then what we've been doing is taking that and saying, okay, let's process what Paul says, but this doesn't seem to correspond with a lot of what we see in our churches. And so we're processing that. These podcasts seem like they're more topical, but they're really deriving from that text and from what Paul's saying.
Mm-hmm. So Paul is defending himself, but he's not defending himself for his sake. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. He wasn't one of the 12, but he was appointed by Jesus. He experienced the risen Christ, and he's defending himself, but it's not in the way that we defend ourselves now. He's not trying to just save face. What was interesting, we talked a little bit this last week as well, like the weakness that he's boasting in. We talked about boasting last week.
Yeah.
And his weakness is actually an extension of his power. We read in chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Which, gosh, that's one of those popular 2 Corinthians verses that you're going to stencil. My grace is sufficient, that kind of stuff. Reading that passage, even just right now, a passage I've read so many times, I've underlined and highlighted. It's are you lying, Paul? You're full of crap. Like my honest response as someone who has been going through stuff and who has felt weak, who has felt calamities, has felt insults and hardships over the last number of months myself. I'm like, nah, you're full of crap. You don't believe that. You're just trying to encourage people. There's no possible way you could actually believe that.
Okay.
I mean,
we talked a little bit.
This is just my honest, raw feelings right
totally
now.
Get it. We talked a little bit before we went online that how hard this was for Paul, what he faced, what he endured. I do think he's not pulling the wool over our eyes, but I think we also have to understand something. Paul got to see the end. I saw things man is not permitted to talk about, inexpressible things. So God knew this is going to be, there's no human way you can endure this, Paul. So I'm going to give you a glimpse of what's next, to which you and I can go, hey, why don't we get one of those glimpses too? Help me out here, Lord. You want me to do what Paul did and be content in everything, but I'm having a little bit of difficult time here. Show me your glory, right? So I think he's serious, but I think he's serious because what he suffered was so unbelievable that God knew he needed even more grace to endure it. And I think that's my grace is sufficient for you type of thing. But what I'm cringing over, Vinny, is how it's used in our American churches. I've learned to be content, and it's like you're content with a full refrigerator. You're content with 2 cars in a nice backyard, or you're content with, even if you live in an apartment, you probably still have good food to eat, and you have more than enough food every day. Most listeners do. And let's go play golf. It's like, man, you stop and you think about the people in Ukraine or the kids in Gaza, and you think, yeah, let's preach that to them. I've learned to be content in any and every situation. We can't preach it to them.
No.
But can you imagine the Christians in Gaza who are saying, I've learned to be content in any and every situation?
That's significant right now, because even the narrative of how we think about the world, what do you mean Christians in Gaza? It's all evil Hamas, right?
Oh, wow.
No, we have brothers and sisters who we could fellowship with on Sundays, sit next to each other and share the Lord's Supper with, who are in Gaza right now, suffering horrific events that's going to mar their family lineage for just generations.
And here's the reality, by the way, the Christians in Gaza are mostly in the north, and there's a serious question whether they're going to actually survive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are staying in the north in churches. It's very clear now that Israel, if anything, they're going to, when they finish this war, whenever they stop it, whatever, that they are going to occupy the northern part of Gaza. But the question actually is, can they even survive this long? They have gone long stages without food, like 30, 60 days without food. And I asked Gary last night when we did the live stream with Gary Birch, as you and I are recording this, and he didn't answer the question specifically because he knows and was in contact with some of the Christians. When I was with Gary in November of 2023, this is now August of 2024, Gary and I were talking with a couple others in November of last year. And he's like, yeah, I just got a call from some of the Christians in Gaza, and they said we'd ran out of food today. Yeah. So that was November. So I don't know, honestly speaking,
and that was only a month into the war.
That was only a month into the war, and they had run out of food because they didn't leave the north. They decided to stay. Israel wanted everybody to go to the south. They said, we're not leaving. They took sanctuary in the two churches, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church there, both of which got bombed. Part of it's been bombed. I have no idea if they have survived or not. And that was the primary Christian contingency left in Gaza, like 900 of them or so. So yeah, it's just, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing?
So if Paul was writing a letter today to the Christians in North Gaza, is he going to say that? Like, how is he going to minister to them with that passage? Is he going to lift that passage from 2 Corinthians 12 and actually encourage them with that?
Maybe Paul, because he's experienced something somewhat similar, and by no means to the extent of the people in Gaza are experiencing right now. This is something that Munther Isaac, the pastor in Bethlehem that I saw last week, Munther can say. This is something that their pastors can say, but you and I can't.
So I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, no way.
Because it's contextual in terms of, like, this is a real life thing happening now.
Yeah.
But most of us in the churches are not going to experience someone firsthand who's going through this sort of horrific thing.
Yep.
When is it appropriate to encourage someone to provide an exhortation like Paul is doing in 2 Corinthians 12, where you just tell them, like, hey, no, even through the worst stuff, it's okay.
Yep.
And when is it inappropriate? Because it's one of those things like, I could call my sister fat, but you better not call my sister fat or I'll beat you up. There's things that I could talk to, but you're not allowed to talk to. When should Christians be mindful of that and not just flippantly throw around these sorts of exhortations? Because it actually doesn't become an exhortation. It's not encouraging at that point.
You know what? What the Christians in Gaza need is for the war to end. What the Christians in Gaza need is for us to go to Washington, D.C. and tell our congressmen and representatives to stop this war. What the Christians in Gaza need is for us to tell Biden and his office, stop sending our tax dollars to continue this war. They need the war to end. And that's what we can do. We can advocate for that because we are the ones controlling the flow of weapons to Israel. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but we gave $20 billion last week, in the last 2 weeks to Israel. More. It's like, what do they don't need anymore. And by the way, we gave them anti-tank shells and things like this. Gazans don't have any tanks. That's clearly to prepare them for a war and an invasion with Iran or if the war escalates. But that's what the people in Gaza need. And there's no way we have. It's like when we lost our child, the one thing I did not need from anybody was, I'm sorry, it'll be okay.
Yep.
You know what?
Or
right
he's in
now,
a better place,
I
or any
know
of that
that.
kind of crap.
Yeah, exactly. I know all that, but that's not helping me right now. I just need somebody to sit here quietly and to shut up. And if you've experienced the loss of a child, then you can talk.
Yep.
I'll listen to you. And you don't go to a mother who just lost a child. You don't go to a husband who just lost his wife. You don't go to a wife who lost her husband and say, it's going to be okay. You don't. And so,
and let's be honest, the mother who lost a child, what is she probably going to say to you? She's probably going to say nothing. She's probably just going to sit with you because she knows what you need in that time. She knows she can say nothing to help you in this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. So us preaching to the people in Gaza, there's no way. I think I told you, Christianity Today did an article on the group that I started up with Bruce Fisk to have conversations across enemy lines, but across the Christian lines of talking with Christian Zionists and whatever. And that article should be coming up pretty soon. And during the interview, he was trying to ask me questions to critique Munther Isaac, who's a good friend of mine. I saw him last week in Southern California. But he's the pastor of the Lutheran Church in Bethlehem. He preached a sermon that went viral, and he's now a global icon, which is great for him and for the things he's doing to bring awareness to the situation. But he preached a Christmas sermon where he put Jesus on a bunch of rubble. His manger scene is Christ in the rubble. The idea of the manger scene is Christ, God incarnating in the middle of our mess. This interview, he wanted me to say some things about Munther Isaac and critique. What would you say that Munther's doing wrong right now? I just sat there and I said, there's no way that I'm going to even possibly try to critique him. I said, by the way, I said, everybody makes mistakes. Martin Luther King Jr. made mistakes. I'm not going to sit there and critique Martin Luther King when he's going through the civil rights problems. And I said, there's no way I can say anything about Munther Isaac. I'm not in his situation. I can't. Of course, he's not being perfect. No one's going to be perfect. But when you're in the heat of the moment, when your members of your congregation have lost family members, when others have lost people you love, when you've lost family members, when there's threats to your own villages in the West Bank, there's no way someone over here from the West sitting, do you want me to go take a step into my pool and then answer the question from there? Right? Yeah. There's just no way I could do that. And so I think that's the same thing that, these verses are great, but really I learned to be content in any and everything for an American Christian to say that, and we're preaching to ourselves right now, it shouldn't be that hard, folks. We got a lot of food. It's going to be 110 out here today, but I got an air conditioner. I'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And if needed, I got some Gatorade in the freezer. If it gets really bad, I'll pop one of those out and defrost it. We're okay. So
Yeah, I think we have this need to want to fix things.
yeah.
And it's oftentimes could come from an insecurity standpoint. It could become from an awkwardness standpoint. I don't know what to say, and so I need to say something. But there's this need to want to do something to make people feel better. And it's the same thing with like awkward silences. When you're in a room and the introverted people have no problem with the awkward silence. They're like, cool, no one's talking right now. But the extroverts are usually the ones that are like, I need to say something because it's quiet. And it's okay to have quiet. To use a musical example, as a musician, you'll totally appreciate this as a non-musician.
Hey, what are you saying? I resemble
Exactly.
that remark.
Yes, you do. So like Miles Davis is considered one of the greatest jazz musician of all time. The guy
yeah, he's totally on the top of my list. Miles D.
But he reinvented jazz so many times. He's just brilliant. And he's known for not being like the flashiest player, but he has this comment that I learned as a young jazz musician where you play the rests. So like in music, you have a note or you have a rest, and a rest is where you're not playing. And his whole thing was like, play the rests, which you don't think about that. So you're just not doing anything at that point. But we think about what are the notes I need to play. And it's like, what are the notes you don't need to be playing, and just allowing silence. And he'll have times where he's soloing and then he just stops for a couple measures and he's allowing the silence to happen. And that's what makes Miles Davis. It's allowing something to breathe. It's allowing, in storytelling, you call it tension and release, right? Where you're building something up and you're having that release moment. Sometimes we just need to have that, and it's okay to have that in conversations. It's okay to have that when you're comforting someone. You can play the rests, you could play the silence, and just allow things to be as they are. Because at the end of the day, we're not as omniscient as we think we are.
Right.
And so do you actually have the answer to this person's problem? Do you actually have the thing that's going to solve this person's problem? Probably not. It's okay just to sit in silence and allow whatever needs to happen. It's okay to let the boiling pot of water, to turn the afterburners off and just allow it to simmer and come down. Those are okay moments to have. We're so quick to want to fix other people. It's okay. Just sit and pray. And how can I advocate for you? My solution probably isn't going to be the thing that is what they need. Ask other people what they need. So anyway, I just get perturbed because I've seen this sort of thing happen in smaller instances, in larger instances. We always want to fix other people. And sometimes we need to say, hey, do I have the right to speak into this thing right now?
Yeah. By the way, I was going to make a snide remark, but play
the jazz
fantasy football as your fantasy football theme, and that explains why your team's so bad every year. But I won't do that. So I'll go ahead and continue. I won't do that. The other thing that people in Gaza need, they need food. They need food. They need medical supplies. They need the bombing to stop. But so for us to sit there and go, hey, be content in any situation as we're chewing on an apple or eating our lunch. No, they need food. This is so unbelievable what's going on there. And again,
we hope you're enjoying the podcast, and we want to remind you that everything we do at Determined Truth, the podcast, Rob's blog, and our YouTube channel is available on the Determined Truth app. Directions on how to download the app is available in the show notes and on the determinedtruth.com website. Just click on the app tab.
And the fact that Paul's response is simply to say, yeah, look at all my sufferings. His whole defense is, I'm an apostle because I've suffered like an apostle. And you're like, Paul, that's their accusation against you. They don't like you because of your sufferings. They don't like you because you're not someone that they can revere and put up on a pedestal and all these accolades. And so Paul seems to fall into their trap and say, yeah, guess what? I'm an apostle because I suffered like an apostle. But that's exactly what Paul's answer is. And I think that's, as we'll get to perhaps later on in the conversation, one of the things that we have to question about the American church or the Western church today.
But what do you do if the recipient isn't listening? What if that's not good enough for them?
Yeah.
And what I mean,
Cry.
When your defense isn't good enough for them.
Yeah, and there's nothing you can do. All you can do is model restraint. Always keep your character above reproach so that they never have that as a justification for why they don't listen to you. Oh, I'm not listening. He's a jerk. He told me off. Never go that step. And even though you're like, would you wake up? like, to the American church. What are you doing? We're endorsing bombs to kill people. What are we doing? Hey, you can be pro-Israel all you want, but this is a genocide. Stop this. For the sake, by the way, this might very well end in the dissolution of Israel as well. The nations of the world are not going to allow this to continue on. So you can love Israel, but this is not what love looks like. But there's nothing you can do. All you can do is give a testimony, let your life model righteousness and Christ-likeness and respect and love for the sake of others. Pray for them and move on. At some point in time, we have to say, don't cast your pearls before swine. And I don't mean that as an arrogant thing, well, that you're just a swine, but do not speak to a fool, for they will scorn the wisdom of your words. And speak to a fool, lest they be wise in their own eyes. And at some point in time, we have to figure out which one of those proverbs is appropriate right now. Speaking to a fool,
I literally was just going to ask if this is a Proverbs 26 situation where you may answer, you may not. It depends on the situation.
Yeah, and there's nothing else I can do. Now, I feel like this, Vinnie. I had a meeting with some people in Southern California recently, and most of the people coming to this group were dispensationalists, and they were hardcore literalists. The book of Revelations, one of the questions like, what do you do with the blood for 200 miles? And it's like, up to the horses' bridles. And I'm like, so they were that there. But most of the people listened, and they listened because I simply started with, it's about Jesus. And here's what the story about Jesus is at. And you bring them along with, I know we can agree with this, find this common ground. We can go here. And if it comes to something like Israel, Gaza, because that's been our conversation now, say, look, we have to respect the human dignity of everybody. We have to respect the fact that you can love Israel. That's great. I understand that. That's awesome. But this can't be good for Israel either. This is not going to go well. The rise in anti-Semitism is going to continue to happen. And Israel is going to be under an existential threat because the nations of the world are saying, we can't allow you to do this. But how do we empathize with the people of Gaza? How do we empathize with the fact that 40,000 people have died in Gaza? And the estimates, and I gave this on the live stream last night, the estimates from the British journal Lancet, which is a highly respectable journal, said that if the war ended today, this is a month ago, that there would be 186,000 deaths as a result of the war in Gaza, because the death toll is anywhere from 3 to 15 times the number of casualties from the war. So you take the number of casualties from war and you multiply that by 3 to 15 times. And John Mearsheimer came on and said the Lancet's way underestimating. It's at least 250,000.
Wow.
And the fact that you got polio, you got all these diseases, you got starvation and famine. And by the way, once famine onsets and you feed somebody, they're still going to have lifelong physical health issues because of being deprived of food for such a long time. You're looking at, I think even Mearsheimer's numbers are an underestimate. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of people dying. How do we come alongside them and show compassion for that? I think that's where we go. Paul does, and as he responds to this accusation of, hey, we're not impressed with you, we don't like your suffering, is Paul, 2 Corinthians 12 verse 1 says, if I must go on boasting, I will boast all the more about my weaknesses. What? No, Paul, don't boast about your weaknesses.
He like doubles down on it.
He doubles down on it. He does go on to say, hey, I did see the revelation of Jesus Christ. I know a man who, and he says it in third person, I know a man who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, saw things man's not permitted to tell. And I think Paul's answer is, that's why Christ can say to me, my grace is sufficient for you, because I've given you the grace that you need to endure this. And I think that's really significant.
So bringing this back to the church, local church, or just Christian leaders, for Paul, we could say that, hey, Christian leadership, while he was defending himself, it's not about his status. It's not about self-promotion. He's not making it about himself, that's a problem that we see a lot in churches today, especially with social media and branding and wanting to promote oneself. There's just, the temptation is probably higher than it's ever been to want to make it about you.
Yeah. And this is so hard for pastors because they're in a very difficult spot. Pastors are under pressure to grow the church. Pastors are under pressure to show that you're doing a good job by bringing more people in, by doing more outreaches and all these things. And so there's this natural response to defend yourself and defend what you're doing. What's interesting is, in terms of the accusations that come, Paul doesn't defend himself. He says, yep, I'm poor. Yep, I work with my hands. Yep, but I'm a slave of Jesus Christ, and that's what I'm doing because Christ is leading us on a procession to death. The 2 Corinthians, and even the entirety of the New Testament for that matter, is calling us as Christians to live what Gorman says on previous episodes, cruciformity, this cross-shaped lives, I guess the best way to say it is that exemplify a love for the other, or that the other is more important than ourselves. So much more important that we are willing to lay down our lives for them. The problem with that, when you're a pastor, and this is why I'm amazed with Paul, is that it doesn't make for big churches. As soon as you do that, pastors are expected to bring people in. They're expected to do all these great things. How big is your church? We talked about. In Paul's interest, no, I'm not out for that. I'm out for this, for the sake of loving others and sacrificing the others. And you know that I was brought into a church in Bakersfield that was, hey, lead us to help us to grow young, bring change in this congregation. There was an older congregation. We wanted to grow young. And I helped them strategize what's this going to look like for the church. But I also knew that, all right, the direction that we're being called to go is not a direction that you're going to want to go, because it's the direction that says we need to meet the local community, that like the people that literally live next door to the church was on a corner, and next door was the church's own house. Next door to that was neighbors, and across the street was a crack house, like literally a crack house across the street. And it's like a city street. So it's 20 yards across the street. We need to minister to them. That's not going to go over well. But I also knew that if I really preach this gospel of sacrificial love for the sake of the other, and I try to live it out myself, this is not going to appeal. This is not going to, I'm thinking, gosh, you want me to help grow a church? I know how to kill it. If I preach the gospel of Jesus, I don't know how this is going to help at all. It's going to kill it. I think there are Christians who want to hear that. They want to go, okay, tell me what cross-bearing love looks like. There's the Christians that buy Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship. I want more of this. But I don't think a lot of Christians want to hear that. So I think this is one of those interesting struggles that I think that we have in the church. And with pastor and pastoral leadership, what does it look like? Because the ones that are doing that don't look like they're successful, when the very fact is they're actually the most successful. Now, by the way, some of them might not look successful because they're incompetent.
Sure.
Yeah. But the ones that are really being successful are not going to look like they're successful by the world standards.
I'm curious, is there a difference between a pastor defending himself, or I'm trying to think, like, defending oneself is not necessarily the same as justifying oneself, as it's not the same as maybe just explaining and clarifying oneself?
Yeah.
Or is that something to nuance out? When is it important for a pastor to say, I'm not trying to be defensive here of me, but maybe I just haven't done a good enough job of casting vision to my congregation on where I want to lead them, and so I need to go through this a little bit deeper. Is there a difference there, or is that just justification?
No, I think there's a fine line, right? There's a fine line. And I think being transparent is important. The problem with being transparent is that you expose a vulnerability, a weakness. And I'm sorry, but in most congregations, there are people who will take advantage of that weakness, and they will stab you in the back. And there's a lot of pastors that are on high alert. And that high alert is, I know that person wants to stab me on the back for it. I had a person critique my grammar. They're like, that was grammatically incorrect. I'm like, who cares? Hey, 99.8% of the congregation had no idea. And I'm speaking. I'm not writing my sermon. It's not up on the screen. And it's just, that tells you that what? They're looking for anything to accuse you of. So you have to be careful there. And it's, people just don't understand what it's like being in that bubble where you're so exposed and so vulnerable. I had somebody critique, Rob lives in a house, it's just too nice. And I'm like, we bought that house because we're going to plant a church out of it. It was across the street from the park in a new community. It came available as one of the model homes, came available. We bought it. We had get-togethers and fellowships in the park. We had Christmas services in the park, Easter services in the park, like across the street from my home. We did outreach. I bought that home to do ministry out of. And now you're critiquing me because it's too nice of a home. No, actually, it's a home that looks just like everybody else in my neighborhood's home. And so I didn't defend myself and things like that. I didn't go, you know what, really, because those are critiques that are just trying to find something. And the other thing, I think I might have said this already, but is when you do have to defend yourself, make sure that your character actually corresponds to what it should be, that you didn't, what they're accusing you of is not something that you did out of bad character or whatever it might be. Just be careful, because it's going to come back against you anyways. And I think that's hard. But then,
so there are times
if you did make a mistake, I'd say admit it, fess up.
I was going to say there are times when it would be appropriate for a pastor to defend themselves then.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially as it's appropriate for the pastor to, at times, to say, hey, this is wrong. I think Paul is defending himself in 2 Corinthians.
Mhm.
He is. His defense is not what you wanted to hear, but he is. I'm an apostle because I've seen Jesus. That's a defense.
Yeah. Would you say
Yeah.
though that because there are times, especially if there's an accusation coming that's just false, that could damage the church or damage your reputation, that's just demonstratively false. Yeah, I need to defend that if I'm
Yeah,
being
of course.
accused of misconduct or something like that. It's, no, we need to address this because this is going to cast light on the kingdom of God, me being a representative as a pastor. Like that would be bad. But if
Sure.
you're a pastor who's constantly defending everything, I think there's a difference between defending and then becoming defensive.
Yes.
And
that's
then
right.
because I've seen that as well, where, oh, you're just defensive. You envision everything that comes your way as a baseball, a pitch that you need to swing at. You can't just let the ball go by. And that's like a kind of a defensive posture where it's okay, when you're defending everything, there's probably another insecurity, or there's another issue there that's probably going to keep you from being effective in leadership. And I would say that's just in life. If you're anyone who's just defensive on everything, what's going on that you have to defend something all the time?
And it comes down to this. The role is to sacrificially, faithfully, lovingly lay down your life for the sake of the other. When you're always defending yourself, you're probably putting yourself as too prominent, too important. I have to defend myself for whatever reasons. And when you do defend yourself, because it is legit, let's say, make sure that you're not throwing somebody else under the bus, because that's not loving towards them. And so it could very well be. And by the way, those people, when they stab you in the back, it hurts a lot.
Yeah.
I can tell you right now, it hurts a lot. But what you can't do is stab them back, because that is not what it is like to pastor and to lead. And you're not modeling for the people who are, let's say, on your team. Okay, I get it, Rob. You're in the right. This is wrong. Now show us how to go about handling this. And that's what you're doing there. And whether you're in leadership in business, leadership in your home, leadership in your family, leadership in your community, whatever, now the way you react is going to model how to do it the right way. And it's not to throw them under the bus. And as far as pastors, one last thing, and that is the pulpit's probably not the best place to do this, because the pulpit becomes a bully pulpit, and it doesn't give the other person the opportunity to respond. This needs to be a conversation, a small group conversation, a group in front of the leadership or in front of the elders if it's a personal thing, a group with that person one-on-one. Be careful about throwing this out to the congregation, especially when you got visitors who don't know what's going on, and they're walking into something like, I don't know what I'm walking into. Yeah. But so there's a lot to be said here.
It creates an environment of spiritual abuse. You use the term bully pulpit. It's funny. There's actually a book written by a PCA, Presbyterian Church of America pastor, or he's a scholar, actually, Michael Kruger, who he does a lot of work in early New Testament Greek studies and manuscripts and that kind of stuff. He wrote a book a couple years ago called Bully Pulpit. I was really impressed because normally folks in that camp are going to be defensive of the role of, speaking of defensive, of the role of being able to speak out in authority and whatnot. And he did a great job of calling out spiritual abuse and things that come from the pulpit. And we don't realize the level of authority that a pastor has.
Yes.
Man, it's just like a parent where
it's worse. It's way more than that.
It's way, because you're speaking for God in a sense.
Yeah, and you're looked up to as some religious, spiritual individual. And we're going to talk about this in our next episode, because we're clearly not going to finish it today.
Yeah.
But go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, to say anything, you need to be very careful. And I learned this even just teaching in classrooms in a church environment. I need to be careful on how I process something out loud or what I say, because even though it's in a study environment, people have the freedom to ask questions and whatnot. Yeah. I'm saying something that has authority. And I think this is why James talks in James 3:1, teachers are going to be judged more harshly. Like, our words matter in a different kind of way that's just going to be brought up in a conversation or Bible study or just groups of people talking together. We have a sense of authority that we speak from, in terms of we could just do a lot of damage. And so when pastors are being overly defensive, when they're especially defending from the pulpit on Sundays, now you're creating an environment where I don't want to say anything then, because I don't want to be used as an example from the pulpit. Oh, he's going through tough times. I can't rightfully critique when something needs to be critiqued, or I can't rightfully speak on something. We develop codependency, and it's not healthy for the church when everything is defensive like that.
Okay, so we have a whole conversation, I think, that's really important in terms of what leadership in the church today looks like in relation to that. Let's save it for next time. In terms of, and one of the points of that conversation is going to be the fact that when pastors do go bad, when they do have problems, they're often unapproachable because they're seen as
Yes.
the spiritual elite giant in the faith who would never do these things.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore they're untouchables. And man, the modern celebrity pastor creates a big problem. So let's save that for our next episode.
This week, we were talking about church leadership. It expanded out once again into the ethic of a real life event like Israel Gaza and how we could practice that ethic there. Brought it back to church leadership. We're going to do that again next week. Would you say that next week we'll spend a little more time in the church leadership side of things?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's talk about that. And let's talk about comparing what we see. This is my opinion, that the mega church scene and how what Paul says in 2 Corinthians about the church and leadership in the church doesn't simply correspond with these mega church celebrity pastors. Paul is his message in 1st, 2 Corinthians is the antithesis of a celebrity pastor. I refuse to be such. I am an apostle because I suffered for Jesus, not because I have a yacht and a home here and wealth and power. And I've written all these books and look at me. And I'm in the green room because I don't want people to see me before the sermon starts. And I don't, they're distant. All these problems, and we'll look at some of the resources and comments on some of this. I think it's going to be really, it's just something that we have to discuss.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. Cool. So next week, how many episodes are we going to do? This is what, week 3, week 2, week 3?
I wrote 5 scripts, but we're in
what's
the
this
middle of
actually
number
going to
2
be,
still. So
what's the over under on 10? Or is it going to be over under
that's
10
good.
episodes?
Yeah.
We should start doing that.
Yeah. I don't bet, but if I were, I'd go over. So
see, that's what we should have, an interactive poll, because when we start
right,
these series, it's like, okay, we're going to do it in X amount, and we never hit that. So we should start making that a thing. And then there could be like a book giveaway for whatever listener.
No, we could actually have them gamble, but here's how we're going to do it. $20 bet if you want to go under. And if you're right, you get 15 back.
So it's not, we're not going to call it gambling. It's a pick'em league.
Yeah, but they're not getting all of it back. So it's a donation to the ministry.
Oh, so they'll still get a write-off.
Yeah, exactly. So and then you bet $100 to go over. And if you're right, 80 goes to the ministry and you get 20 back. And you feel like I won $20. And it's great. Good. Yeah.
I just pulled up the podcast, and we still are sitting on that 1 review and in 17 ratings. Come on, people. Come on. We labor over this. We bleed over these podcasts. I've been physically injured doing these podcasts. Maybe
my throat is, it's barely even hanging in there, Vinnie.
I'm sensing right now. There's one of you. Your
name is Kristen.
Robert or Kristen.
Oh, there you go, Robert.
Yeah. And one of you, you have your phone right now. You could just scroll up and you could leave a rating and a review. Come on, I'm seeing it. Sorry,
I know there's an Aaron out there.
hey, there we go. What's up, buddy?
We do know there's an Aaron out there. Aaron, if you're listening, stop. Pull the car over.
Come on, buddy.
Come on. And get 10 friends. Get 10 friends.
Yes, there you go. All right, everyone, go and actually, while you're scrolling down, look at the show notes, all the stuff we talked about, the intro of the new things happening. So you could check out if you want to sign up for a new study. We're bookending this. Do you have a new study popping up at any time, or how do yours work?
So yeah, our study on Wednesday nights, we're going through the book of Acts. And as we get to the book of Acts to a certain place, hey, Paul writes this letter here. Then we start talking about that letter, and then we go back to Acts. So we're doing Acts. By the time this goes live, we'll have just started a series on 1 Corinthians. So if you missed our 1 Corinthians podcast series, or you got it, but you want to be part of a discussion in a community, then let me know. We're going to start 1 Corinthians in early September.
Perfect. So early September, 1 Corinthians with Rob on Wednesday nights.
2024.
Early September 10th for me is going to, on Tuesday nights is going to be the Gospel of John. So if you're interested in getting into one of those studies over Zoom, you can do that. So those will be in the evening time.
Great.
So
thanks, Vinnie.
Awesome. Cool. All right, everyone. See you guys next week.
No, say it again.
See you. I'll be watching you. Just like Sting says.
I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.